I was on the ground, powerless, feeling like nothing could lift me up. Shame consumed me, and for a moment I thought everything was lost. But something inside me refused to give up. What I didn't know was that this fall, instead of breaking me, would make me discover a strength I never imagined I had. And in that moment something started to change within me. But what happened next no one could have predicted. Life has unexpected ways of testing us. One moment everything seems ordinary, routine. The next, a single event can turn our world upside down. That day started like any other. I woke up early, made my coffee, and went out to take care of some errands. The sun was shining brightly, and the city seemed to follow its usual rhythm. I took public transportation as I always did, and went on my way without any idea of what was about to happen. It was at the corner of a busy street that everything changed. A misstep, a bump, and suddenly I was on the ground. My bags were scattered, my body sprawled on the sidewalk. People around me stopped to look, but no one approached. I felt heat rush to my face, not from the impact of the fall, but from the shame that flooded me. Heard laughter. Some people whispered among themselves. Others pointed. A teenage girl took out her phone and started recording. My heart pounded. The feeling of humiliation was overwhelming. I wanted to disappear, to have the ground swallow me up right then and there. I took a deep breath and tried to get up, but a sharp pain in my ankle stopped me. That's when I heard a gentle voice beside me. An elderly woman with gray hair extended her hand to me. "Are you okay, my dear?" Those words, simple and sincere, gave me a new breath. I accepted her help, and though struggling, I got up. The shame still burned inside me, but the unexpected kindness of that stranger brought a small relief. I limped away without looking back. The laughter still echoed in my mind, and the humiliation felt greater than any physical pain. But at that moment, without realizing it, a seed was planted inside me. Something in me was starting to change. I walked slowly, feeling every gaze on my back. Were they still laughing? Were they talking about me? That feeling of being watched, analyzed, and judged was suffocating. I reached a bench in the square and sat down to catch my breath. My ankle throbbed, and I massaged the area carefully, trying to organize my thoughts. I couldn't understand why this had affected me so much. It was just a fall, right? How many times had I stumbled in life and moved on? But this was different. I wasn't just falling to the ground. I was being exposed, ridiculed. The world didn't allow me the right to fall in peace. The world watched and laughed. Minutes passed, and I remained there trying to process everything. Then a small boy, no older than 5, approached me. He held a lollipop in his hand and looked at me with curiosity. "Miss, did you fall?" he asked with the innocence of a child who has yet to know the cruelty of the world. I smiled, even though my heart was still heavy. "Yes, I fell." He frowned, deep in thought, then held out the lollipop to me. "Will this make it better?" My chest tightened. How could something so simple be so meaningful? I accepted the lollipop with a genuine smile. "Thank you. This helps a lot." His mother, watching from a distance, smiled at me before calling him back. I looked at the candy in my hand. It was a small gesture, but somehow it brought unexpected comfort. That was when I realized something. I could choose how to carry that moment. I could allow that humiliation to define me, or I could turn it into something greater. The weight of shame was still there, but along with it, there was now a spark of strength. I stood up, taking a deep breath. I still had a long way to go, but for the first time that day, I felt like I could take the first step. In the days that followed, the humiliation continued to echo in my mind. The laughter, the stares, the feeling of being exposed to the world. I tried to move on, but every time I looked in the mirror, it was as if I were still on that cold ground, surrounded by judging eyes. I decided to avoid that street. I changed my route, taking longer paths just to avoid the risk of encountering someone who had witnessed my fall. But the truth was, the problem wasn't outside. It was inside me. I started to realize that the shame I felt wasn't just about falling. It was something deeper, something that had built up over years of feeling invisible, of being ignored. The fall had only materialized a feeling I had already been carrying. One night, after avoiding the subject for too long, I sat in front of the mirror and forced myself to face my own reflection. Who was that woman staring back at me? Sunken eyes, slumped shoulders, a tired expression. But deep down something still shimmered. A flicker of strength, however fragile, was still there. I needed to regain my confidence. So, I did something that seemed simple but was incredibly difficult. I left my house without fear. I didn't care if someone would recognize me. I didn't care if they would talk about me. I needed to free myself from that moment. I walked with firm steps, forcing my mind to focus on the present, not the past. The shame still lingered around me, but with each step, it lost its grip. Before I realized it, I was back on that street. The same place where it all happened. My feet hesitated, my heart raced. But I wouldn't turn back. I looked around and noticed that no one seemed to remember. The city carried on, people went about their lives. The moment that haunted me so much meant nothing to them. Only to me. And that's when I understood the truth. I was the only one still carrying that weight. The only one allowing that day to define who I was. And in that instant I decided to let it go. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I took a deep breath, lifted my head and crossed the street. For the first time since that day I felt truly free. In the following days, a new process began within me. As if, little by little, the wounds of my soul were being treated, but with a slow and painful healing. The street that once brought me so much fear now seemed different, less threatening, less immense. It was as if, step by step, the world was retreating while I moved forward. The feeling of being watched diminished, and with it, the shame began to lose some of its power. But what I didn't know was that the real transformation would happen when I least expected it. Time kept passing, and with it, small moments of victory began to accumulate, like tiny bricks being laid to build a new foundation for my life. I started smiling again, not with the lightness of before, but with a smile that carried something deeper. Acceptance, a strength gained over time through the challenges I had faced. The feeling of shame was no longer as present, though it still lingered, like a shadow appearing at unexpected moments. However, I was beginning to understand something important. The shame I felt was not truly mine. Had been imposed on me. It was something the world had tried to make me carry, but I no longer needed to accept it. I realized that I didn't have to be perfect, that it wasn't the absence of flaws that would make me a better person, but rather how I dealt with them. My imperfections were no longer something to be hidden but a part of me. I was no longer the woman who shrank before the world. I was the one who embraced her own fragility. Perfection, I now understood, was nothing more than an invisible prison we all tried to escape, yet so often trapped ourselves within. However, as with any journey of self-discovery, moments of insecurity and doubt still arose. One of them happened in a cafe, on an ordinary afternoon. I was sitting at a table trying to focus on my work, but my mind wasn't really there. I watched the people around me, their faces concentrated on their conversations, their own worries. I was trying to move forward, yet something inside me still held me back from being fully present. That's when I overheard a conversation beside me. Two women, unaware of my presence, were talking about something that caught me off guard. Their words hit me abruptly, as if all of a sudden my past, that shame I had been trying to leave behind, was being dragged back into the light. They were talking about the day I fell. Unintentionally, they described every detail, as if nothing else mattered beyond that moment. The laughter, the looks, my fall. The scene seemed to play itself out again in the space between us, and for a moment, all the weight of what I had tried to forget came crashing down on me. I felt my body tense, the fear of being recognized, the dread of being judged again. The feeling of exposure returned, and for an instant, I almost wanted to disappear. But then, something started to shift inside me. A quiet strength, like a flame rekindling within me, reminding me of who I was, where I had come from, and how much I had already overcome. Instead of hiding, I stood up from my table, took a deep breath, and with firm steps approached them. My eyes were calm, though my heart was racing. I walked over without hesitation. They looked at me, surprised by my approach. I knew what they expected to hear, or perhaps what they feared to hear. But I was no longer afraid. "Yes," I said, my voice carrying a sincerity and determination I hadn't known I possessed. "I was the woman who fell. And I'm here to rise every single day. Every moment, every second." The conversation fell silent for a brief instant, the words hanging in the air. It wasn't an awkward silence, but a silence of understanding, as if they were processing my words, reflecting on their weight. One of the women, her expression shifting from surprise to something softer, finally spoke. "Hey, I admire your courage," she said, almost with unexpected shyness. "I wonder if I could do the same if I were in your place." I looked at her, and for a moment everything seemed to align. I knew exactly how she felt. It wasn't easy to deal with shame, with the weight of others' judgment. But there was something liberating about being honest with yourself, about allowing yourself to be vulnerable. Vulnerability, rather than weakening us, connected us. It was a bridge between us, a way of understanding that we all carry something, that we all have our own falls and struggles. The conversation continued, but something inside me had changed. I was no longer the woman who hid. I was no longer the woman who feared being seen. I was the woman who got back up, stronger and more authentic with every fall. And in that moment, I understood true strength. It wasn't about never falling, but about rising every time you did. It was about continuing forward, seeking the freedom that only comes when we fully accept ourselves, with all our flaws, fears, and insecurities. As the conversation unfolded, I realized that this exchange of vulnerabilities wasn't just a relief for me. It was a lesson for them too. Sometimes all we need is for someone to show us that it's possible to rise, even when the world seems determined to push us down. That we can be stronger, more authentic, more human if we simply embrace our own humanity. In that cafe, between unspoken words and understanding glances, something shifted within me. I was no longer a prisoner of shame. I had learned to use my vulnerability as a source of strength, and that made me freer with each passing day. And in that instant, I understood that my journey of self-discovery wasn't just mine alone. It was part of something bigger. Something that perhaps wasn't just about me, but about all of us who, with courage, choose to rise day after day. Over time, I began to realize that the transformation process didn't just happen from the inside out, but also from the outside in. As I freed myself from the ghosts of shame and self-criticism, the small gestures of daily life started to take on a deeper meaning. I no longer looked at people with the fear of being seen as weak. Instead, I learned to look with empathy, with understanding. I discovered that all of us, at some point, feel small, vulnerable, imperfect. And that didn't make us any less worthy of love and respect. There was something magical in the simple act of walking through the streets now. The same streets that once felt like a maze of fear and insecurity had now become a familiar landscape. People passed by without looking at me with judgment, and if someone did, it was as if I had already learned to accept their gaze without letting it shake me. I knew I couldn't control what others thought of me, but somehow I started to care less about it. What truly mattered was what I thought of myself. What I didn't expect was that, on one of those peaceful days, something would happen to show me that my healing journey was far from over. I was returning from a morning walk, the first light of the day still gently illuminating the path. My body felt at peace, as if the days of struggle were finally giving way to an inner calm. But then, as I turned a corner, I saw a group of people. They were gathered around a spot, and what caught my attention was the sound of laughter. And it wasn't friendly laughter. It was sharp, mocking laughter, the kind that reminded me of what I had heard on the day of my fall. A chill ran down my spine, and for a moment I thought about looking away, going back home and hiding again. But no, I was different now. I was learning to deal with it. As I got closer, I realized that I wasn't the target of the laughter. It was a young woman. She stood there, completely exposed to everyone, her face marked by shame. Her posture was low, shoulders slumped, as if she were being consumed by the weight of humiliation. It was like looking at myself years ago, in that exact moment when the world seemed to want to swallow me whole. Something inside me warmed, a flame of compassion and at the same time of fury. I didn't know exactly what to do, but I couldn't just stand there, motionless, watching another person be crushed by the cruelty of others' judgment. I remembered how, in those early days, I had felt completely alone. I remembered the pain, the shame, the feeling that the whole world was watching and laughing. But now, I knew I couldn't let this young woman go through the same thing without offering some of the courage I had found within myself. I didn't know what she was feeling, but somehow, I felt that I could help her not drown in that shame. I took a deep breath, stepped forward, and with a voice firmer than I thought I was capable of, I spoke to the group around her. It's easy to laugh when you're not in her place. We've all been through difficult moments, but we shouldn't make someone feel less because of it. The group went silent for a moment, surprised by my intervention. Some stood frozen, others tried to hide their discomfort. The young woman, for a brief second, looked at me, as if it were the first time someone had noticed her pain. Her eyes were empty, but there was a small spark of gratitude. I knew she wouldn't walk away from there healed, but maybe in that moment she knew she wasn't alone. Those few words didn't change the world, but for her maybe they made all the difference. At that moment, I felt that I was no longer just the woman who had fallen. I had become someone who, in some way, could help others rise as well. I didn't have all the answers, I didn't know how to change the world's cruelty, but I knew that together we could be stronger. As the group dispersed, the young woman looked at me once more. Her eyes were now a little softer, less bitter. She didn't smile, but there was something in the air, a silent exchange between us. Something that reminded me that, no matter how personal our internal battles were, mutual support could make all the difference. I went back home, but something had changed within me. I was no longer just someone who needed help. I was someone who now had the strength to offer relief to others, even if only for a moment. Perhaps true healing wasn't just about rebuilding ourselves, but also about extending a hand to those still in the process of getting back up. And by doing that we healed too. In the days that followed that encounter, something inside me became clearer than ever. I was in fact changing, not just in how I saw the world but in how I saw myself. The feeling of transformation wasn't instantaneous. I knew the journey would be long, that I would continue to face challenges, fears emerging from the shadows. But at the same time, there was a growing confidence in my ability to face those challenges. I had experienced pain, shame, and yet I had risen. And most importantly, I knew I didn't have to do it alone. That young woman, although her face had never been fully revealed, remained imprinted in my mind. Something about her, her vulnerability, her pain, made me look inside myself in an even deeper way. She wasn't just a stranger. She reflected the part of me that I had tried to hide for so long. Her shame was, in some way, my shame. But the way I stood up in that moment, how I was able to intervene and offer something more than silence, showed me what I had yet to see. I was stronger than I imagined. Over time, I began to realize that my journey of self-discovery wasn't just about me. The healing process I was going through was deeply intertwined with those around me. Daily encounters, superficial conversations. All of it started to take on new meaning. It was as if, by opening myself up to my own pain, I also became more capable of connecting with the pain of others. That young woman wasn't the only one. Everyone around me had their internal struggles, their falls and new beginnings. And in some way I was also part of their fight. What once seemed like a solitary battle now revealed itself as a collective journey, where we were all trying to find our place, our peace. I started to change the way I interacted with people. No longer with a fear of being judged, but with a genuine desire to understand their stories, to listen with empathy. Every person who crossed my path became an opportunity to learn something new, to see the world from a different perspective. I began to understand that by helping others, I was also helping myself. Every smile, every word of encouragement, every gesture of support became a small brick in the construction of a renewed confidence in myself. It was in this process of exchange that I found something I didn't even know I was looking for. A purpose. The emptiness I had felt for some time, that space between who I was and who I wanted to be, was beginning to be filled. I didn't know exactly how it would happen, But I felt, in every fiber of my being, that my journey had a deeper meaning than simply regaining lost confidence. I was becoming someone who, through their own scars, could help others find their own strength. On one of the calmest days of my life, when I least expected it, fate brought me a new opportunity. I was in a bookstore by chance. I was already used to passing by there on my weekly walks, but that day something called me to the back of the store. I was there just to distract myself, to relax and lose myself among the bookshelves. But when I entered the self-help section, a book cover caught my attention. It was a simple title, but it seemed to carry immense depth, The Journey of Starting Over. Without thinking much, I picked up the book, started flipping through its pages, and immediately felt connected to the words written there. It was a story of overcoming a journey similar to mine. Someone who had gone through so many falls but, in the end, found peace within themselves. It was as if that book had been written for me, as if it was a continuation of the path I was already walking. I bought the book, not knowing exactly what it would bring to my life, but feeling that, in some way, it would be a guide, a light to illuminate the path ahead. When I got home, I devoured the book in a few hours. Every page seemed to resonate within me, as if the words were my own, as if those experiences had been written by someone who knew my soul. By the end of the book, something had changed inside me. I was no longer just a woman fighting against her own fears and failures. I was someone with a story to tell. A story that could touch others, that could help others rise again. That was when the idea of sharing my journey with others began to take root. Deep down, I knew my transformation wouldn't be complete until I started to share what I had learned, what I had lived, with the world. The words, the story I carried, could be the key to someone else's healing. And that gave me new energy. I knew that the next step in my journey wasn't just to continue my own healing, but also to extend a hand to others. I was ready to share what I had lived, to transform my pain into something beautiful, something that could inspire. In the following days, I started planning how I could share my journey. I thought about videos maybe, or a blog, something that would allow my voice to reach people going through similar situations. I didn't know exactly where to start, but I felt that book had given me the confidence to take the first step. I had something to offer, something that was mine and that could help others find themselves, just as I had found myself. And with this new purpose, this new mission, I began preparing for the next chapter of my life. I knew there would still be challenges, moments of doubt and insecurity. But now, I had a greater reason to keep moving forward. I had a mission. And that alone was enough to give me the strength to continue. The idea of sharing my journey with the world began to grow within me with an unexpected force. I knew the process wouldn't be easy. It would be vulnerable, difficult, and at many moments terrifying. But at the same time, there was a need inside me that could no longer be ignored. I had taken small steps in my own healing journey, but something was still missing, as if the act of sharing my story with others was the final piece needed to complete my transformation. That night, after days of reflection and mental organization, I sat at my desk with my computer in front of me. My heart was racing, my mind running in 1,000 different directions. I knew I had to start, but the words seemed to escape me. I thought about how to begin writing, how to turn pain and resilience into something that would touch people's hearts. The first words were difficult, as if a part of me still hesitated, as if I was afraid of revealing more than I was ready to share. But then, I remembered a phrase I had read somewhere, perhaps in a book I had bought, or maybe it was one of my own reflections. Vulnerability is the bridge to connection. That thought sparked something inside me. Vulnerability, that feeling of exposure that terrified me so much, wasn't something to be avoided but something to be embraced. It was through my vulnerability that I would find connection with others. People don't connect with perfection. They connect with truth, with pain, with the human process of growth. I took a deep breath and started typing. The first sentence was simple but sincere. I fell. And more importantly, I got back up. Every word I wrote seemed to fall into place naturally, as if my mind and heart were in sync, guiding me along a path I didn't fully understand but knew I had to follow. As the words began to form on the screen, something inside me started to shift. The tension, the fear, the doubts began to fade away, as if I was truly taking the first step toward freeing myself from something I had kept inside for so long. But like any journey of transformation, doubt and fear quickly returned. When the text was almost finished, I stared at the screen, frozen for a moment. I knew I was about to do something big, something that would change the way I saw myself and the way others saw me. And that was terrifying. What would people think of me? What was I exposing, revealing? The fear of judgment, of criticism, haunted me once again. The feeling of vulnerability, of being completely exposed, made me hesitate. But this time, fear would not control the situation. I had been through too much to let it win now. With every step, every fall, and every new beginning, I had learned that fear only had the power I allowed it to have. I no longer wanted to be a prisoner of that fear. I knew that by sharing my story, I wasn't just giving something to those who would read it. I was also freeing myself from something deep inside me. The fear of being judged, of being seen as weak or incapable, was beginning to lose its grip. So, with a deep sigh and a feeling of lightness, I clicked the publish button. The text was out in the world. I didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long time, I was at peace with my decision. Whatever happened from that moment on was beyond my control. I didn't know if my story would be heard, if it would touch someone. But at that moment I realized that, regardless of the outcome, I had already taken the most important step. I was being true to myself. In the following days, as I waited for a response, I felt a mix of anxiety and excitement. I didn't know how people would react. The fear of judgment was still there, but it was becoming more distant. Slowly the comments started to arrive. Some were short and simple, while others were longer and deeply emotional. Many spoke about the pain of feeling invisible, of carrying the weight of shame. Some said my story had deeply resonated with them, that they felt the same pain I did, and that reading my words made them feel less alone. Others simply thanked me, saying they needed to hear that message at that exact moment in their lives. Each message was a relief, as if the world was somehow aligning with what I had done. But more than that, I realized I was creating a support network, a community. It wasn't just about me, it was about all of us. It was about the stories we share, the struggles we face, the new beginnings we often don't believe are possible. But by supporting each other, by truly listening, we become stronger. Then I received a message that changed everything. A woman wrote to me, saying she was going through an incredibly difficult time in her life. She was at a breaking point, feeling lost and hopeless. But after reading my story, something inside her shifted. She thanked me, saying that because of my words, she felt she could rise again, that there was still something inside her pushing her to keep going. She thanked me for being vulnerable, for sharing my pain, because in doing so, she found the courage to look at her own pain differently. That message was a turning point for me. I knew that sharing my story wasn't just about me. It was a bridge to others, a way to help those who were fighting their own battles. And no matter how difficult it was, I knew that this was my purpose, to be a voice for those who hadn't yet found their own strength. That woman wasn't the only one. The messages kept coming, each one bringing a new perspective, a new story of resilience. Little by little, my pain transformed into something much greater. I was no longer just the woman who had fallen. I was the woman helping others rise, just as I had done. The following weeks were a whirlwind of emotions. I was beginning to realize that by sharing my story, something inside me had changed forever. The fear that once paralyzed me seemed to gradually dissipate. Every comment, every message, every word of support I received became confirmation that I was on the right path. But at the same time, doubts continued to arise. I questioned myself. Am I really ready for this responsibility? When people started seeing me not just as a flawed woman, but as someone who could inspire, it created an internal pressure. I feared that, at some point, I might fail. I was afraid of not being able to live up to the expectations that others now had of me. However, the biggest lesson I was learning was that I didn't need to be perfect. I didn't need to be an unattainable figure. What I was sharing was my real journey, with its failures, fears, and achievements. There was nothing wrong with being imperfect. In fact, that was precisely what made people connect with my story. I wasn't selling an illusion of perfection, but the truth that even in our fragilities, there is strength. That even in our falls, there is the possibility of starting over. So I decided to keep writing. Not to please anyone, but to continue my own journey of healing. For me, more than helping others, this process became a space where I could understand myself, reflect, and grow. Writing became a daily practice, a place where I no longer needed to hide my vulnerabilities but instead embrace them. I was no longer afraid of being seen as weak because, on the contrary, I realized that true strength came from acknowledging our weaknesses and still moving forward. In one of my most recent texts, I wrote about the impact that the journey of overcoming has on the relationships around us. Many people, when faced with a significant internal change, drift away from those who have not yet changed. I experienced this myself. Throughout my healing process, I realized that some people in my life couldn't keep up with this transformation. Not out of malice, but out of a lack of understanding. The old ways of relating, thinking, and acting no longer made sense to me. I was in a new space where pain and shame no longer held the same power. And although a part of me wished others would also share this new perspective, I knew that not everyone was ready for it. That was when I learned one of the most important lessons. Some people are part of our journey for a time, but when we are going through a transformation, some of them simply can no longer keep up with our pace. Not because they are bad or negative, but because each person has their own journey, their own time to grow. And it is essential to respect that, even if it means leaving some people behind. This is not an act of abandonment but of self-care. I learned to let go of the ties that bound me to relationships that, while valuable in the past, were no longer aligned with who I was becoming. Of course, this didn't mean that I stopped loving those people, but I began to understand that to stay at peace, I needed to distance myself from certain influences that were not helping me grow. That wasn't easy. It was difficult to look at relationships that had been important and realize that they could no longer be the foundation of support I needed. But I also knew that to continue my own journey of healing and self-discovery, I needed to be surrounded by those who inspired me to be the best version of myself, who helped me see beyond my fears, and who challenged me to grow. On one hand, this process of distancing was painful. There were moments when I felt the weight of loneliness, thinking about the connections I was losing. But at the same time, I realized that I couldn't allow those relationships to prevent me from being who I truly was. I needed to be in tune with myself before trying to make sense of the world around me. I needed to learn to love and respect myself first so that I could offer that to others. It was during this period of reflection that I decided to take a bolder step. I wanted to share not only the aspects of my journey that had already been overcome but also those that were still in progress. I realized that people often only share happy endings, the victories achieved. But the real journey, the true transformation, happens in the struggle along the way. I wanted to be honest with those who followed me. I wanted to show that change is a continuous process, full of ups and downs. I was still healing, still rediscovering myself, and it was okay to admit that at times I didn't have all the answers. This led me to create a more open and vulnerable space on my platforms. I started posting short videos where I talked about daily challenges, the fears that still arose, and how, at times, the journey seemed endless. I wasn't an expert in overcoming. I was an ordinary woman, with my insecurities and victories, learning to deal with my own demons. And in doing so, I realized that the response from people was even more powerful than I had imagined. By sharing my weaknesses, I was allowing others to do the same. I was no longer just talking about healing. I was actually creating a space where we could all be honest about our pain and fears without the burden of perfection. My vulnerability became the strongest bond of connection with people. By no longer being just the woman who had overcome shame, I became the woman who was still overcoming day after day, and that made all the difference. And as I shared my story, the stories of others began to intertwine with mine. With each message, with each comment, I felt that I was no longer alone. My journey was no longer just mine. It was part of something bigger, something that touched other hearts and showed that true strength is not about being perfect but about continuing, even when we feel weak. Time passed, and I found myself in a place I never imagined I would be. My journey of overcoming had not been easy, but with each step I felt stronger, more authentic, more whole. I had overcome the shame, fears, and doubts that once consumed me, But what I didn't know was that true transformation wasn't in conquering obstacles, but in accepting the process. Messages and testimonies from others kept coming in, and with them I felt more connected to the world in a way I had never experienced before. I was being heard, and the most beautiful part of it was realizing that by giving my voice, I was also allowing others to find theirs. And it was no longer about being an inspiring voice or someone with a perfect path, but about being a witness to real life, with its ups and downs, its battles and victories, all equally important in the end. It was at that moment that I realized how much my journey had intertwined with the journeys of so many others. It was no longer just about me. It was about us. I was no longer alone as I once thought, because deep down, we are all in this journey of transformation together. Each of us, with our stories of pain and resilience, with our falls and rises, is part of something greater. Looking at the reflection of who I had become, I realized that I was no longer a broken woman. I was someone who had learned to rebuild herself, day after day, with humility and courage. I had reached a point where I no longer needed external validation. Before, I needed others to tell me that everything was okay, that I was capable. But now, I knew that the greatest validation came from within. I had learned to look in the mirror and see not just the woman who had fallen, but the woman who had risen. And not just once, but many times. I was the sum of all my experiences, all my choices, all my fears faced, and all my silent victories. I was proof that starting over is possible, and that often the most important journey is the one we take within ourselves. Of course, there were still moments of insecurity, days when doubt returned. But now, instead of letting it consume me, I saw it as a natural part of the process. Uncertainties and challenges no longer scared me because I knew that no matter what came my way, I had learned how to handle it. I knew myself more than ever before. And in that self-knowledge, I found a peace I never thought was possible. Then I received a message that changed everything. It was from a woman who shared a difficult moment in her life, a recent loss that had left her feeling lost. She spoke about how my story had touched her heart, and for the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe again. My journey, with all its flaws and mistakes, had been the spark she needed to find her own path to healing. There were no words to describe the impact that message had on me. At that moment I realized that my story was not just mine. It was a beacon for others, a way to show that even in the deepest pain, there is always a chance to start again. Seeing the impact my experience was having, I knew I couldn't stop. It wasn't about completing my journey, it was about continuing to inspire, to be real and authentic, and, above all, to be a voice for those still fighting in silence. The story does not end when we rise. It continues to be written every day, with every new challenge, every new encounter. However, I no longer wished to save anyone because I understood that no one needs to be saved. True transformation happens when each of us gives ourselves permission to be vulnerable, to look inward, and to find the strength that has always been there. I am no longer the woman who fell. I am the woman who chose to rise again and again, even when it seemed impossible. And as I looked toward the future, I saw that my mission was to keep walking, with my feet firmly grounded in the present and my heart open to others. I had discovered that the greatest victory is not reaching a destination, but knowing that as long as we are willing to move forward, the path will always be ours. It doesn't matter what the world thinks of me because, in the end, I am the one who decides who I am and who I can become. The journey I began that day, when I looked in the mirror and made the decision to move forward, has no end. It is not about the final destination, but about the process of reinventing ourselves with every step. And as long as I continue walking with courage and truth, I know that my story will always be a story of overcoming, not of perfection but of authenticity and resilience. And that, in the end, is what truly matters. Because deep down we all have the ability to rise, to be stronger than we ever imagined. All it takes is believing in ourselves and staying true to our own truth. And so I move forward,